What if everything you've been through, every loss, every failure, every door that slammed in your face, was never random? What if the very things that felt like they were destroying you were actually building you? Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable: most people will never find out. Not because the answer isn't available, but because they're looking in completely the wrong direction. They're waiting for life to get easier when the secret was never about ease. It was about sight. About learning to see what ordinary eyes simply cannot see. And today, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Here's the paradox that nobody warned you about: the people who look the most blessed on the outside are often the ones who walk through the most fire on the inside. The chosen ones, the ones living with genuine purpose, unshakable peace, and a sense of direction that doesn't waver when life gets hard, they didn't get there by avoiding the storm. They got there by understanding something about the storm that everyone else missed. There are 7 secrets hidden inside the hardest moments of your life. 7 things that ordinary people simply cannot see. And every single one of them has been working in your story whether you recognized it or not. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever felt like your life was falling apart for no reason, like God had forgotten your name, like you were too far behind to ever catch up, this is for you. Not in a vague, motivational poster kind of way. In a real, specific, it actually makes sense now kind of way. Because spiritual awakening isn't reserved for monks in monasteries or people who've already figured everything out. It happens to the broken ones. The overlooked ones. The ones sitting in the middle of a season they never asked for, wondering what on earth God is doing. Sound familiar? Good. Because that's exactly where the most important revelations tend to arrive. Here's your first challenge before we even begin: there's something most people never figure out about pain, and it's not their fault, really. From the time we're kids, we're taught that suffering is the enemy. That if something hurts, something must have gone wrong. So when life hits hard, the first instinct is to run, to numb it, to scroll past it, to pray it away as fast as possible. And look, that reaction makes total sense. But here's what ordinary people simply can't see: pain isn't a punishment. It's a process. And the ones going through the deepest fire? They're not being destroyed. They're being made. See, there's this idea in spiritual awakening circles that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the idea that suffering has a sacred purpose. Not random torture, not pointless agony, but a deliberate, intentional shaping. Think about it like a potter and clay. The clay doesn't enjoy being pressed, stretched, and thrown against the wheel. But the potter isn't being cruel. He's being precise. Every squeeze, every spin, every moment of pressure is pulling something out of that clay that couldn't come any other way. And the chosen ones, the ones who've been through it, they start to recognize that feeling. That this is the wheel. Here's something worth sitting with: every wound, if you let it, becomes a womb. That phrase might sound poetic, but it's dead serious. The word womb is about gestation, something growing in the dark, unseen, before it's ready to be revealed. The Apostle Paul wrote it this way: our momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. He didn't say despite the troubles. He said the troubles are achieving something. That's a completely different posture toward pain, and it changes everything about how someone walks through it. This is one of the most misunderstood spiritual signs in a believer's life. Now, practically speaking, how does someone actually shift that mindset in real time, when it hurts? One powerful thing to do is journaling through the pain, but with a specific question: what could God be building in me through this? Not, why is this happening? That question leads to frustration. But, what is being built? That question leads to discovery. Writers like Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust and wrote Man's Search for Meaning, found that the people who survived the unimaginable were the ones who could find meaning in it. That book, by the way, is one of the most life-altering reads for anyone walking through a dark season. Rejection might be the most universally painful human experience there is. Doesn't matter who you are, the sting of being turned down, passed over, walked away from, it cuts deep. And for most people, that cut becomes a wound they carry for years. They replay the moment. They wonder what they did wrong. They start building walls, shrinking themselves, chasing approval from the very people who already showed them the door. Ordinary people collapse under rejection because somewhere along the way, they tied their entire identity to being accepted. And that's exactly where the trap is. But here's what the chosen ones eventually learn, and this is one of those spiritual signs that only becomes visible in hindsight: every closed door was protecting you from a wrong room. Think about that for a second. Not blocking you. Protecting you. There's a difference between a door that's locked against you and a door that's locked for you. The job you didn't get, the relationship that fell apart, the opportunity that evaporated right when you thought it was yours, none of that was God forgetting about you. That was God's plan for you moving in a direction your eyes couldn't track yet. Divine redirection rarely feels like redirection. It feels like loss. Here's a real example of this. Steve Jobs was famously fired from Apple, the company he built. By any ordinary measure, that was a devastating rejection. He called it the best thing that ever happened to him. Why? Because it freed him to start next and invest in a little animation company called Pixar. The rejection that looked like an ending was actually the setup for something far larger than what he was holding on to. Now, not everyone's story has that kind of Hollywood arc, but the principle is the same. What left your life made space for what's coming. That's not wishful thinking. That's spiritual awakening working through real events. One of the most practical things someone can do in a season of rejection is to resist the urge to immediately replace what was lost. The natural human instinct is to fill the gap fast: new relationship, new plan, new hustle, because the emptiness is uncomfortable. But that emptiness? It's actually a waiting room. And the mistake most people make is leaving the waiting room too early. Instead, try this: write down every major rejection you've experienced in the last 5 years. Then, next to each one, write what actually happened after. 9 times out of 10, there's a thread. A pattern. Something better, something more aligned, something that wouldn't have been possible if the first door had opened. And this is where God's chosen begin to see differently from everyone else around them. Here's something that most people would never say out loud at a dinner table, but that doesn't make it any less real: there is a war being fought over your life right now. Not a metaphor. Not a motivational figure of speech. An actual, invisible, relentless battle over your mind, your calling, your relationships, and your future. Most people brush past this idea because they've been conditioned to only trust what their physical eyes can confirm. If they can't see it, touch it, or measure it, it doesn't exist. But that kind of thinking is exactly what makes someone easy to defeat, because the most dangerous battles in anyone's life are the ones they don't even know they're in. This is one of the most sobering truths in spiritual awakening: the enemy does not waste his energy on meaningless targets. Think about that. A general doesn't deploy his best forces against an empty field. He sends his heaviest artillery toward the positions that matter. So when life feels like it's coming at you from every direction, when the attacks are relentless, when the pressure won't let up, when it feels like something is working against you at every turn, that's not a sign that God has abandoned you. That's a sign that something in you is worth fighting over. The intensity of the warfare reveals the magnitude of the purpose. And that changes everything about how the chosen ones interpret their hardest seasons. The Apostle Paul put it plainly: we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age. Now here's what's fascinating about that verse: he said we wrestle. Not, we watch. Not, we observe from a safe distance. We wrestle. That's an active, engaged, physical word. Which means God's plan for you was never passive survival. It was active participation in a fight you were equipped to win. The chosen ones who understand this stop blaming people, stop blaming circumstances, and start addressing the real source of the resistance in their lives. That shift in perspective is not small. It is seismic. Practically speaking, this changes how someone prays. Instead of praying from a place of defeat, God, why is everything falling apart? They begin to pray from a place of authority. Books like The Invisible War by Chip Ingram or Fervent by Priscilla Shirer are genuinely life-changing for anyone who wants to understand this battle on a practical, tactical level. These aren't abstract theological texts, they're field manuals. They teach you how to identify what's really under attack in your life and how to fight back with precision. Because spiritual warfare isn't about being dramatic. It's about being awake. And here's what the chosen ones know that ordinary people simply can't see: you are not a victim of your circumstances. You never were. The chaos, nobody talks about loneliness the way they should. It gets treated like a problem to be solved, a symptom of something broken, a gap that needs to be filled as quickly as possible. So people grab their phones, turn on the TV, make plans they don't really want to make, anything to avoid sitting alone with their own thoughts. And honestly, that restlessness makes complete sense in a world that never stops moving. But here's what ordinary people miss entirely: some of the most important moments in a person's spiritual awakening don't happen in a crowd. They happen in the quiet. In the empty room. In the season when, for reasons that don't quite make sense yet, almost everyone seems to have drifted away. The pattern shows up throughout history in a way that's impossible to ignore once you see it. Moses didn't receive his burning bush moment at a networking event. He was alone in the desert, tending sheep, in what looked like a completely wasted season of his life. Elijah, one of the most powerful prophets who ever lived, had his most intimate encounter with God not on a mountaintop of victory, but under a tree, exhausted and asking to die. And Jesus, before the most important 3 years in human history, spent 40 days completely alone in the wilderness. The chosen ones throughout every era seem to share this one common thread: before the mission, there was the silence. Before the calling was announced, it was confirmed in solitude. Here's the thing about silence that most people don't realize: it's not empty. It just feels empty to anyone who hasn't learned to listen yet. There's a frequency that God speaks on that gets completely drowned out by noise, busyness, and constant social input. And the divine appointments that happen in loneliness aren't scheduled in advance. They sneak up on you. A thought that won't leave. A scripture that hits differently at 2 a.m. A deep, quiet knowing that something in your life is about to shift. These are spiritual signs, and they almost always arrive in the spaces that ordinary people are too distracted to notice. The chosen ones learn, often through many uncomfortable seasons, to stop running from the quiet and start leaning into it. Practically, this might look like carving out what some call a sacred hour, 1 hour a day with no phone, no music, no input. Just silence, a journal, and openness. It sounds simple. It's actually one of the hardest disciplines in modern life. But writers like A.W. Tozer, in his book The Pursuit of God, describe this kind of intentional stillness as the single most transformative practice available to a human being. Not because silence is magical, but because it clears the static. And when the static clears, things become audible that were always there, always speaking, always trying to get through. Most people go their entire lives without ever hearing it. Not because God wasn't talking, but because they were never quiet long enough to listen. And here's where it gets really interesting, because loneliness, when it's truly understood as a divine appointment, stops being something you endure and becomes something you actually protect. The chosen ones who've been through deep seasons of there's a particular kind of pain that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's not the pain of failure. It's the pain of waiting. Of doing everything right, believing all the right things, putting in the work, staying faithful, and still watching the clock tick without anything moving. Ordinary people in that position do one of two things: they either give up entirely, or they start forcing things. They manufacture their own breakthrough. They take matters into their own hands because the wait feels like evidence that something went wrong. And that impatience, as understandable as it is, ends up costing them more than the wait ever would have. Because what they can't see, what most people simply aren't equipped to see, is that the delay is part of the plan. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths in any genuine spiritual awakening: divine delay is never divine denial. Say that again slowly, because it doesn't sink in the first time. The fact that it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. It means God is being surgical. Precise. The same God who orchestrated the parting of a sea, who brought water from a rock, who raised the dead, that God is not scrambling to figure out your timeline. He's working within it, on purpose, with intention. And the chosen ones who've learned to trust that timing carry a peace in seasons of waiting that genuinely baffles the people around them. Because from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But on the inside, everything is being prepared. Here's a real-world picture of this. A diamond takes somewhere between 1 and 3 billion years to form under the earth. Billions. And the entire process requires extreme pressure, extreme heat, and an almost incomprehensible amount of time. Pull it out too early, before the process is complete, and what you have isn't a diamond. It's just carbon. The pressure wasn't the problem. The weight wasn't the problem. The problem would have been interrupting the process. And here's what that means for God's plan for you. The version of you that receives the promise needs to be as carefully formed as the promise itself. God isn't just preparing your destiny. He's preparing you for your destiny. And that takes exactly as long as it takes. Practically, one of the most powerful things someone can do in a season of waiting is to study the lives of people who waited well. Joseph waited 13 years from the dream to the throne, 13 years of betrayal, slavery, and false accusation. Abraham waited 25 years for a son he was promised when he was already old. David was anointed king as a teenager and spent years running for his life before he ever wore the crown. These aren't just Bible stories, they're blueprints. And reading biographies of people like Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison before becoming president of South Africa, reveals the same pattern outside of Scripture. The wait wasn't wasted. It was working. And this is the shift that separates the chosen ones from everyone else in a season of apparent stillness. They stop trying to. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone who goes through a serious spiritual awakening, and it's one of the most quietly stunning experiences a human being can have. It's the moment when you look back at your life and suddenly, for the first time, it all makes sense. The thing that broke you at 22. The friendship that ended without explanation. The opportunity that collapsed right when you needed it most. Viewed in isolation, each of those moments looked like evidence that life was random, cruel, or indifferent. But from a certain distance, with enough time and enough perspective, you start to see something that was invisible while you were living through it. You start to see the threads. And what looked like chaos starts to look like a tapestry. This is one of those truths that ordinary people genuinely cannot access, not because they're not intelligent enough, but because they're too close to the canvas. Imagine standing 1 inch away from a masterpiece painting. All you'd see is blobs of color, random brushstrokes, patches of dark that seem to serve no purpose. Step back 20 feet and suddenly the image appears. The dark patches weren't mistakes, they were shadows, giving the light its meaning. That's exactly how God's plan for you works across the timeline of a life. The painful seasons, the detours, the seemingly wasted years, they weren't interruptions to the story. They were brushstrokes. Every single one of them placed with intention by a hand that could already see the finished image. Here's something worth considering from a completely real, documented example. J.R.R. Tolkien lost his father at age 3, his mother at 12, and his closest friends in the trenches of World War I. By any ordinary measure, his life carried an almost unbearable weight of loss. And yet, every one of those experiences fed directly into the mythology of Middle-earth. The longing for a father. The grief of watching a world destroyed. The fierce loyalty between friends forged in suffering. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was accidental. The man who gave the world one of the greatest stories ever told was himself a man whose pain had been woven, thread by thread, into something eternal. The chosen ones eventually recognize that same pattern in their own stories, and it changes the way they read every chapter, including the ones they're still living through. Practically, one of the most transformative exercises anyone can do is what some call a providence map, sitting down with a journal and drawing a timeline of your life, marking every major turning point, loss, and unexpected shift. Then, with fresh eyes, looking for the connections. Here's a question that most people carry quietly, often for their entire lives, without ever saying it out loud: am I enough? It shows up in 1,000 different ways. In the way someone works twice as hard as everyone else just to feel like they belong. In the way they shrink themselves in relationships, always giving more than they receive, terrified that if they take up too much space, people will finally see through them. In the way they chase achievement after achievement, not because they love the journey, but because somewhere deep down, they believe their value is something that has to be earned. And that belief, quiet, stubborn, exhausting, is one of the most effective lies ever told. Because it keeps people performing for an approval that was never required in the first place. This is the secret that cuts deepest, the one that ordinary people spend their entire lives circling without ever landing on: you were chosen before you were born. Not chosen because of your resume. Not chosen because you got it all together or finally figured out the right formula. Chosen before you made a single decision, before you had a single success or failure, before you even drew your first breath. The prophet Jeremiah heard it directly: before I formed you in the womb I knew you, before you were born I set you apart. That's not poetry. That's a declaration of identity that predates time itself. And the chosen ones, the ones who've had genuine spiritual awakening, eventually stop arguing with it and start living from it. That shift, from performing to simply being, is one of the most radical transformations a human life can undergo. Here's what makes this truth so quietly revolutionary: it doesn't just change how someone feels about themselves. It changes how they move through the world. Think about the difference between someone who walks into a room believing they have to earn their place there, shoulders slightly tense, words carefully chosen, always reading the room for signs of approval, and someone who walks in already settled, already at peace, already knowing who they are. Same room. Completely different presence. The second person isn't arrogant. They're just free. Free from the exhausting performance of trying to become something they already are. And that freedom is exactly what God's plan for you was always pointing toward: not a life of striving, but a life of walking in the authority of someone who was already chosen, already loved, already enough. One of the most practical ways to begin internalizing this truth is through what theologians and therapists alike call identity work, intentionally replacing the inherited beliefs about your worth with what God actually says about you. This isn't positive thinking. It's accurate thinking. Books like The Search for Significance by Robert McGee or Abba's Child by Brennan Manning have helped millions of people, not just Christians, but anyone wrestling with deep questions of worth and belonging, rewire the story they've been telling themselves about who they are. Reading them slowly, journaling through them, is not a passive exercise. It's an active dismantling of a lie that has likely been running in the background of your life for years, quietly costing you more than you realize. And this is where the whole journey, every topico, every truth, every hidden thing that ordinary people cannot see, arrives at its deepest point. Because all of it, every wound with sacred purpose, every rejection that redirected, every spiritual war, every season of loneliness, every divine delay, every invisible thread, all of it was always pointing here. To this. To the moment when someone stops performing for approval and starts walking in the authority of someone who was already chosen. Signs from God were never meant to make you feel special in a shallow way. They were meant to wake you up to something that was already true before you ever started looking for it. You were not an accident. You were not an afterthought. You were known. You were named. And everything that has happened in your life has been part of preparing you for a purpose that was written before the world began. The only question left is whether you're ready to stop hiding from it. So here's where it all lands. 7 secrets. 7 truths that ordinary people spend their entire lives walking past without ever seeing. Suffering that carries sacred purpose. Rejection that was actually redirection. A spiritual war being fought over your life right now. Loneliness that was always a divine appointment. Timing that is a weapon in God's hands. Invisible threads connecting every single event in your story. And an identity that was settled in eternity before you ever took your first breath. None of this was accidental. None of it was random. And none of it, not one chapter, was wasted. But here's the question that matters now, the one that separates the people who consume this kind of content from the ones who are actually transformed by it. What are you going to do with it? Because knowledge that stays in your head and never moves into your life is just entertainment. And you didn't come here for entertainment. You came here because something in you knows there's more. More purpose, more clarity, more of what God actually placed inside you before the world ever got a chance to tell you who you were. So let's get specific. Which one of these 7 truths hit you the hardest today? Which secret made you stop and think, that's exactly where I am right now? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, don't just watch and scroll. Tell me which truth landed. Was it the one about suffering? About rejection? About the invisible threads connecting your story? Because here's what I've learned from years of walking through these conversations with people. The truth that hits you the hardest is almost always the one God is trying to use right now in your specific season. It's not a coincidence that you're watching this today. It's not an algorithm accident. These are spiritual signs, and the chosen ones learn to pay attention to them. So pay attention. And now here's the most important question of all, the one I want you to sit with long after this video ends. Are you still living like someone who has to earn their place in God's story? Or are you ready to start walking like someone who was chosen before the foundation of the world? Because those are 2 completely different lives. One is exhausting. One is free. One keeps you running in circles. One moves with purpose, with authority, with the quiet unshakable confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are and exactly who is walking with them. The awakening is available. God's plan for you is already written. The only variable is whether you choose to walk in it. If this spoke to something real in you today, if something shifted, even slightly, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment that tells me your story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on the notifications, because what's coming next on this channel goes even deeper than what we covered today. We're talking about the hidden patterns in the lives of God's chosen, the spiritual signs most people dismiss, and the practical steps toward a life that actually reflects the divine purpose you were created for. You don't want to miss it. And honestly, I don't think you found this channel by accident. I think you were supposed to be here. So stay. Let's keep going. Together.